is an interview with Luke Tripp. It's been done by his daughter, Azania Tripp, produced for the General Baker Institute in Detroit. I'm Hetty Tripp of WISMS International. Today we're talking about the transformational visit to Cuba in 1964 that Luke Tripp shared with General Baker. Now giving it over to Azania, who will be doing the interview. Over to you, Azania.
So, Dad, you went to Cuba with Charles Johnson, General Baker, and Charles Simmons, and this was because of your involvement in Uhuru. Can you tell us a little bit about your involvement and how your organization became recruited to be selected to go on the trip to Cuba as a social justice activist at that time?
During the early 1960s, Charles Johnson, Charles Simmons, General Baker, and I were students at Wayne State University in the state of Michigan. We formed an organization called Uhuru. I was the chair of the organization. We were a direct action student organization. Our own backgrounds, we were all Black working class students. We were all commuting to Wayne State University, which was largely a commuter university. It's a very large university, over 33,000 students, but many of us lived in the city of Detroit, so we weren't campus, we weren't working out of dorms, right? And many of us had jobs. We had jobs. We called the bus to the campus to do our homework, and all of us were were aware and conscious of the intense anti-Black racism in the city of Detroit. And so most of our activities, we organize ourselves to fight against anti-Black policing. Detroit was a very rigidly racially segregated city. For instance, even on the campus, a few blocks from the campus itself, very few Blacks could get an apartment on the campus. It was that, it was apartheid Johannesburg style. And of course, in terms of employment, Black folks, if they were hired, they were hired, but they was usually the first fired if there was going to be a reduction in staff. And it was always the daily kind of humiliation, in shopping, being under, surveillance all the time by the police, by employers and all. And so the racism was very raw. And we formed the organization. Uhuru was perhaps the most radical Black student organization during that period, during the 1960s. And
what made it the most radical? Because that also, that gave access.
Okay, by radical, particularly in terms of ideology. For instance, I became an activist at age 19 in 1960. I was part of the first wave of Black student protesters, and I became a member of the Friends of SNCC organization. They had recruiters that came to Detroit. And I joined that organization, and I participated in demonstrations in the South, in Nashville, Tennessee. We had the training at Fisk University, and there were students from across the nation, Black students and white students. And in the demonstration there, I remember we were picketing a restaurant called TikTok restaurants, right? And I became firsthand in terms of how racist crowds develop through their stages. So there were over 100 students there, but we were divided into small groups of about 9 or 10. In our little group, there were about maybe 3 or 4 white students and 4, and the rest were Black students, right? 6. Okay. So as we were picketing, a hostile white crowd formed across the street, right? And here's how these crowds become more and more hostile. first, they go through phases. Phase one, they call names, racial slurs. For blacks, some they call them nigger this, nigger that. For the whites, they say you're race traitors, you're nigger lovers. Okay. So you first attack with slurs, right? And then the second phase, you get attacked with threats, what they're going to do to you, and physical threats. And the third stage, once they get all rallied up, all prepped up, and get ready for the third move, which is to come across the street and get physical. Right now, fortunately, the police came and there was no physical contact. But I just seen these white hostile faces foaming at the mouth, glazed eyes, and all that. The face of that's why face of the white America that they don't teach you about in schools, right? And of course. And then of course there was the dynamics among the black students and the white students. Now the white students were not ordinary white students. Right? Many of them were, if I compare them with the average white students, the white students who were part of the movement, part of our group, first of all, they were highly intelligent, intellectual. I mean, these were thoughtful students who reflected and thought about the world, their place in it. And most of them were from, white universities, like prestigious universities, and they came from homes where the parents were very well educated. But the most important factor is that they had a strong moral compass. And so that explains why we were there, because they felt in terms of their own integrity, that if they subscribed to those humanitarian values and there was a struggle and they wanted to change the world, then they belonged among the ranks of those who were struggling, right? Now, we black students, so they're fighting for these kind of values. Well, we're fighting for humanitarian values too. However, our life experiences were very different from theirs. The racist society recognized their humanity because they were white. Hey, okay? For blacks, different kind of story. I mean, we had to fight every single day for our basic human rights, for our basic humanity, for our basic dignity. It got down to that level, right? So most of the white students subscribe to the nonviolence, not only as like a way of fighting and responding, but also as a philosophy. Most of these black folks, well, as a tactical method, okay. As a philosophy, even as a tactical method, we come from the Detroit, hey, those whites come across that street, getting ready to get physical, we're gonna thump. We're not gonna go into no Hagani hunch and hope to get the no, it's gonna be a punch out, okay? So that was our attitude. Okay, so that's a little background on how I entered the student, being one of the first wave of black students. And because all through high school, in Detroit, I was a very angry student. Right? I mean, to see the indignities that you had to deal with, the practice of racism in the schools, the school system assumed that you're some kind of dummy and you're just written off, right? I mean, dismissed. So the system was sending all these messages about how you were viewed and your so-called value, which is almost nothing, okay, and all that. And so we going through schools, we started being warehoused, right? And so you only fit to do manual labor, or to join the military to be cannon fodder, or a potential prospective jailmate, or prison mate. I mean, that's how the system viewed. So any person that should become conscious and aware, and I think many of the students here, my other comrades in Uhuru, Uhuru was formed of those who basically began to reflect on their lives, and then we began to self-study about we wanted change, we wanted revolutionary change. And so we were most radical because we began to say, look, who are those people who revolutionize their society. Who brought about those changes? So we began to look at the revolutionary leaders during our time. I mean, who's making change? Oh, they made significant change over in Russia. They got Soviet Union. They're making changes in China. You know, Mao Zedong, they got this communist right. They making change in Africa. You have these revolutionary, and all of them gravitated towards radical left politics that was driving it. And so we began to look at, and even in Latin America and in Cuba, we were very inspired, you know, by the
What
Cuban
books
Revolution.
or historical moments sparked your interest, particularly with the Cuban Revolution? Because you got to go there and speak and be
Mhm,
at that space for a solid of 2 months with very close friends.
mhm.
Before that, and you're talking about these things that changed you. Can you?
Okay. Well, I was just telling the beginning of my involvement, you know, active involvement in that, why was motivated behind that rising consciousness. And those stories are kind of similar for General Baker, for Charles Simmons, and for that. So we began independently to study those revolutions. And then there were some radical groups uh, at the University of Michigan, some white left groups, and they were organizing a trip to go to Cuba. So we have been involved at the University of Michigan with demonstrations and things like that. And we became aware of this this organizing the student group that was being organized to go to Cuba in 1964. And so we signed up for it, right? The four of us. And I said, the reason why we signed up for it, because we left, we studied these revolutions. We were greatly inspired by the Cuban Revolution, by what Fidel Castro and Che Guevara was doing. And they were, and of course, you got to remember that Che Guevara and Fidel Castro and the role that they played in South America. As a matter of fact, when Nelson Mandela was released from prison, he said the first place and the first leader I want to visit is I want to go to Cuba, and I want to embrace Fidel Castro, but what the Cubans did, because the Cubans sent armies to fight the South Africans in Southern Africa, right, when they were invading. So we had tremendous respect for the Cuban Revolution and the Cuban leaders, and so that's those in SNCC and all. They were still trying to. Most of them were still thinking about integrating into the U.S. To U.S. society. In our position was the U.S. society, this capitalist
Can you
society.
stop? Sorry for a second, because the recording stopped, so then it's going to be cut off.
Sorry about that. I was trying to get the transcript going, but I started the recording again. So yeah, sorry about that.
So do you want to go back a couple ideas?
Okay. As I was going back in terms of some background of why, what motivated us and why did we go to Cuba? And it was across our knowledge about what the Cuban leaders were doing, like Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, and the kind of relationship that they had with Black Africa, the kind of relationship that they had with China, the relationship they had with the Soviet Union. And so we identified and aligned ourselves with those larger political currents. And so we began to study the Cuban Revolution, trying to follow it. And of course, a little background, Cuba was very much in the news because, see, in the up until the Cuban Revolution, U.S. capitalists controlled the economy of Cuba. You know, they had their nightclubs and all that legal stuff was there was the mafia and all those things. And then plus their large industry was the sugar industry. The U.S. dominated that, and all of the other ministries and all of that. That was always U.S. capitalists. And what happened is when the revolution, well, Fidel and Castro said those industries are going to be controlled by the people, right? And so when they began to nationalize those industries, the U.S. government organized a force to fight against the revolution. And so the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, recruited Cubans, right-wing Cubans, right-wing Cubans to invade Cuba to overthrow the revolution, right? And so and we know how the capitalist system worked in the U.S. It exploited Black folks, brown folks, and all. They didn't give a tune. And the U.S. capitalism was spreading its imperialists. And so the point here is that now we know essentially that the Cuban Revolution is for real, because the U.S. the U.S. government and the capitalists in America want to destroy it, right? And so that inspired us more. And at that time, the U.S. government State Department, they did not want others to know and learn about what the Cubans were doing, how they were their plan to basically establish a system that would serve the Cuban people, because it was against the white capitalist interests here. And so what they did is that the U.S. government, the white capitalists controlled the U.S. government, so they put a ban. No, you can't go to Cuba. Americans, you can't go to Cuba. So they had a travel ban and all that. And then they wanted to control the narrative and saying what Cuba's being hijacked by these communists and they're going to be totalitarian and people are not going to have any freedom, all of this sort of thing. So you don't want people that just don't know the truth. So you keep it, you don't want to go there and to find out what the truth is. All right. So since they had that ban, the group could not just take a plane from the US and fly over to Cuba to find out what, because the US was trying to prevent that by putting a ban on it. And there was no direct flights because the US was trying to isolate, and they wanted to strangle Cuba. And they set up an embargo on Cuba. I mean, they did not even allow a Band-Aid to be shipped to Cuba, right? I mean, that's how tight that was. So what we had to do, we had to undercover, catch some planes, caught a plane, and we went to Chicago. That's where that's where the four of us, and then we caught a plane to Philadelphia, and then we flew from Philadelphia to Paris, and then we have to go to Czechoslovakia to get a Cuban plane to fly us, and then we made our way back to Cuba. So we had to go this long, indirect way because of the ban and the difficulties the U.S. government. All right, so we're in Cuba. Now, what did I observe? So the background is, backstory is, how did we end up in Cuba and why? Okay, so that plays with that. Now we're in Cuba. Now, what did I observe? Right, I'll speak from my own standpoint because everybody have their own stories, right? General and Charles and all that. But here's what I saw. First, what impressed me most was the spirit of those people. I mean, they were kind of hyped up. It's like they're breathing fresh air. They're no longer under the boot of the United States. And that enthusiasm just flowed from the youth. So we would go to these big political rallies at these big stadiums, and these students would come in, they come in with the drums, they coming in marching and Libya and all that. So, I mean, the vibes coming from the revolution, from the freeing, of filling Cuba, and this is our country, and we control this country. So the most important thing was that spirit, that vibrant spirit. That's all. So what else did I witness? Well, Cuba has one of the most advanced medical systems in South America, in Latin America, right? And one of the most highly educated population. So that was part of primarily of the agenda of the Cubans. What do our population need most? They need good health, they need to be educated, and they have to be housed. And so that's what we're going to focus on. So they had a intense literacy campaign because there was still great, especially in the rural areas, the literacy rate was rather low. So they recruited and had youth, like youth our age and even younger, and all of them going out to the villages, going out there to teach us, the Cubans, how to read, because how are you going to get the message? So it's very important for the government to know what was happening, their role in it, and they want the literate population. You cannot build a modern organization with an illiterate population. So they put a high priority on that. And what they did is that there were a lot of wealthy Cubans there. In these big mansions, they changed them into dormitories and learning centers and daycare centers, right? So when the wealthy, many of them fled to Miami, right, as part of that elite, all that, those big estates and all that, they changed them up and opened up those for the people. So, and when they set up these schools and education, you know, at each school, they had nurses and all. I mean, the medical, the health thing, and they did it as they built their communities, right? And they want to tie everything together, you know, the health care of the students, the educational care of the students, all that is tied together. And then they had organizations at the neighborhood level. Each had a revolutionary committee, right? Because they were all involved in transforming Cuba from a so-called country of exploitation by the white capitalists in America. And here's how you gain control of your own country and your own community. And it's got to be organic. It's got to be grassroots, and we got to build it up.
Was there any particular questions that you wanted to ask people in the community before you went? Since like you're coming in with a lot of this like theory understanding, and then you're in the space and you're seeing how this like socialist network is being implemented. Were there particular questions that you wanted to ask before, and then once you saw it, how did those questions change for you?
Well, first, our approach was, you know, to make the observations, right? It's not like and so see, this was, you're getting back to a split of the white students and black students. So there were about 84 students, about 10 or 11 were black, the rest were white. There were a couple, I think a couple Puerto Ricans and Chicanos, part of the mix too, right? But that was a physical fight between the black students and these other white students, because we came, see, the black students, we came there to learn, right? We know that we were kind of sort of, yes, we came there because we're inspired, we want to learn. We saw ourselves as part of the revolutionary struggle. What can we learn from the Cubans that we can employ, that we can use in our own struggles? And we want to express solidarity with what they were doing. Those were our motivations. Now, some of the white students, they came and said, why are you doing this? Do you guys have freedom of the press? Where are your dissenters? You know, and that's why the fight came. You know, all this thing, are you doing it the right way? And blah, 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 and all that.
And that fight happened when
that white arrogance,
was Shea
right, and all that. So we came in
Castro
there.
speaking? Or
say what?
Was that happening when, because I think during the interview with General Baker, it was mentioned that had happened when, I don't know if it was Fidel Castro or Che Rivera was speaking to your group of around 80, 84 students, and that Caucasian students were asking a lot of like maybe historical facts or what had happened in the past. And that had agitated a lot of you, and that there wasn't a lot of maybe group solidarity with the Americans that were brought to Cuba.
Well, you've probably been in community meetings where some white liberals come in and ask some off the wall questions, right? And so that, you know, coming from their little privileged position. And so it's the kind of things that will kind of irritate you with the kind of questions that will come from people who are, you know, come from an unacknowledged privileged position. Now we're coming from a position where we're facing police brutality on a daily basis. They got us pinned in these segregated areas. We've been humiliated. left and right, right? And so if you come in from that perspective, if you come in from a position of oppressed folks, your approach to folks who are dealing concretely with that oppression have different kind of things. Many of these liberal white students will have abstract questions, like to what extent do our dissenting voices appear in your papers, right? I mean, is it just a party line thing, or is it open? Can people freely express their, all this kind of stuff, right? And so and it's those kind of questions, those kind of attitudes that basically irritated us, because that's the same kind of thing when we were struggling in uh, in the United States. They say, well, I know when we're planning protest demonstrations, and then some white students say, well, did we get a permission from the city council? Permission? Are you kidding me? We ain't gonna ask to permission for us to protest for our rights, right? So they ask these off the wall questions, and we're gonna protest regardless of whether we aren't gonna go ask, hey, are you guys allowed to protest? So those kinds of things irritated, because we experienced that back in Detroit, in America. Now here we are in Cuba, and they asking these same off the wall questions, right? And so that got on our last nerve, and that's where the fight broke out. Okay. So the other thing is that in terms of there were some very solid progressive white students there, right? But you did have this foul elements too, so it's not everybody's in the same bag coming from the same place. All right. So getting back to
wasn't there also students coming from, I know that in the writings that you wrote, you said you had met students coming from Vietnam, and so that had sparked a lot of interest for you. So just wondering, were they a part of that 84 group, or was that like how did you meet those students?
Oh, the Vietnamese were not part of our group. The Vietnamese were these fighters from Vietnam, from the Liberation Front. And I said that they were supposed, because Cuba began to host all of these liberation from Africa, from Asia, all those places, people who were fighting against capitalism, who was fighting against imperialism, who were fighting against militarism. They found a place in Cuba, and Cuba was trying to support them, and have all these liberation groups sort of come together to discuss, to exchange ideas, those kinds of things. All right. So the Vietnamese I saw, no. As a matter of fact, I don't think there was any Asians among our group. Okay, the Asian population was very, very minuscule. In 1960s. I never saw an Asian person until I went to the.
So did you so when you had the opportunity to meet with these other creating freedom fighters,
yes, and I'm going to
you and your friends were exploring, or was that from your relationship with Robert Williams that was exiled there?
Okay, I'm going to get to him, but let me deal with the other international students. So the Vietnamese were at the cutting edge of fighting against the U.S. imperialism in their own country. And I said that when they spoke, of course, if there's any translation, it's going to be translations from Vietnamese to Spanish, right? So that left us out. So I did not understand their language, but I understood their body language in their eyes. And I said, to me, they sent off a vibe. And the vibe that they sent to me is that there's no military force on earth that's going to defeat us. It's not going to happen. Okay, this is our homeland, right? And so I knew they had that fighting spirit and all that, and so I know in the end, you're just going to have to hang it up. They got that superior technology and the planes and the bombs and all that sort of thing, yeah, but they're not going to defeat these people, right? And so I mean, through their the genius of their strategies of how do you fight asymmetrical warfare when the other side has superior weapons and all of that. And they figured it out in terms of how you fight them and how you bring them down. So it's not just, kind of military superiority, but political, and then getting political support even from even from a lot of Americans with the anti-Vietnam campaigns. And so they factored in all these things. How are we going to fight them in the battleground? How are we going to fight them politically? What kind of support we're going to have globally and all of that? So it took all those things. It wasn't strictly military, because militarily, the U.S. could just drop a nuclear weapon on them and blow them all up. Okay. But, so I attribute their success to, I just straight out, they had superior intelligence in terms of how to fight that war. And that's why then they had the dedication, and they had the to get it done. And so that's why they won. That's why the U.S. lost. So these other groups, see, the U.S. had a ban. The U.S. said you can't go to Cuba, you can't go to China, you can't go to North Vietnam, and you can't go to Albania. And the general said, hey, we're gonna go to all of them, including Albania, right? And so we made it a point that every place that the U.S. government told us that we couldn't go, that's where we definitely gonna go and talk with these folks. Okay, so so we went to all of the offices held by these refugees, because we went over there to learn. We went over there to interact. We didn't go and went over there to observe what the Cubans were doing. We come over there to learn from the Cubans, not to call a lecture to Cubans and see, well, you should be doing it this way, and that's okay. Some of the students had that arrogant attitude, and that's why, they got slapped down. Okay. Now, Robert Williams was a Black liberation fighter here. I think you're a part of it. He was president of the NAACP in North Carolina. There was the KKK and all these white racist groups. And he said that we not only have to, we're nonviolent, but we're going to protect ourselves. And so he organized Black men with guns and said, if the Klan and these other white terrorist groups come in, if they shoot, we shoot them back. Okay. They come in shooting, we're going to shoot back. Okay. And then, that any Black liberation fighters, if you fight for freedom, you are the U.S. government going to put you on their hit list, right? Okay, that's what happens. That's the way it works. I said, if you live, but it makes sense. If you live in an intensely anti-Black society, and you got an anti-Black structure, any force that's that is anti-racist is going to be punched. So, the civil rights struggle, the Black Power struggle, and all that, all of them were anti-racist struggles. In the larger sense, they were anti-racist struggles. What does anti-racism look like in civil rights? So it's not only anti-racist, but it's broader in terms of having a vision of a society whose core values are that of sharing. So they're based on these humanitarian values. And it's one of inclusive, white, yellow, red, it does not matter. Your humanity does not have a color. Okay, your humanity does not have a color. All right. And so putting people in these color categories and all that, and manipulation and all that sort of thing is just a way you divide folks, get folks to learn that. So Robert Williams sought refuge also in China. They supported him, Mao Zedong, and the Cubans, Castro, Che Guevara, embraced them. And it's just like the Cubans, Castro, and all that. That's why Nelson Mandela says, my strongest brother is in Cuba. I want to see. He got on that plane, got out there, and went to Cuba. He said, that's brother number one. Okay. Because he sent troops, even troops, to have to fight the apartheid regime. Nobody else did. The Russians didn't know. The Cubans did, though. Okay.
So when you arrived in Cuba, what did Robin Williams show you, or what?
Well, we were there for a
Recently with
while,
him
but
as
you know,
well.
he wasn't
Because
at
he
the
was there
airport.
in 1996,
What I'm
1961.
right. When we arrived, you know, it was sometime before we met with right. He was not at the airport. Okay, I mean, but and so we sat down with him because we had a great deal of respect for him for you know his work and the struggle, and even on the international scene, you know, internationalizing our struggle. So so we connected with him, talked with him, just like we talked with all the other revolutionary fighters from all over the world. And it was our sense to, in a concrete way, to connect and link up with revolutionary fighters. I mean, when we were in Detroit, we just read about them in books, you know, and all that in the papers, but we never saw them in the flesh. So we saw them in the flesh and saw that and knew that sort of link. And, you know, that sort of influenced our identity, right? And then we're not only, you know, like we're part of this global movement to fight against oppression, to fight against racism, to fight against capitalism, because it's a global fight. And who are your real allies? And who are your real brothers and sisters? And who are your real enemies? Okay. And so, you know, when we returned from Cuba, we were, you know, even more inspired and began to and continued our organizing until you know you went and
Yeah,
developed.
can you so was this the first time you ever left North America when you traveled to Cuba?
Uh, yeah, North America's you know, Detroit's right next to Canada, so I've been back and forth. But going to Cuba, that was my first air flight out of the country.
Did Detroit like look and feel different to you? And did your interpretation alter because you were able to see an environment where you were seeing a collectivist function?
Mhm.
How was that modified and how did that, what particularly actions did the four of you take, or did you kind of separate into your own revolutionary work? What did that look like?
Okay, let me see if I understand the question. You said after I returned from Cuba?
Yeah, so I think the first question is after you returned from Cuba,
Yes.
did Detroit look different, feel different in any way? Because that's kind of something that happens
Mhm.
commonly when people
Yeah, right.
nationally, they're like, oh wow, I see a different viewpoint. It's
Mhm.
not something that happens
Mhm.
to you, which is
Mhm.
fine. And then like I won't ask this question in the future, right? Or do you feel like there was any like
Mhm.
it changed your perspective?
Okay. Um, there was not, for me, there was not a significant change. Here's what happened. Um, in Detroit, as a Black person, you know you're in an intensely racist society, right? That really doesn't value you. Going to Cuba made a huge difference. You can see the contrast. You can feel the difference, right? So going to Cuba, you know, you experience about like being an individual, a human being, and then you go back into the pot. Right? Okay, so return to Detroit.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what I mean though, right?
It's like,
So it's like
it's
a
like getting
culture
out of
shock.
prison,
So you
going
experience a
out,
culture
have some
shock.
free time, and then going back in prison. Okay, all right.
Mhm.
You have experience, you know, concretely, you know, like how does it feel being in an unracist society, right? I mean, that was a
So
dramatic.
then I'm right. That's what I said.
That's right. Okay, but I'm
You
saying
said I was
when I
wrong.
went back, no, I'm just saying going back into Detroit, I'm angry again, right? Because I'm back in the
Yeah.
fight, right?
But
Right.
you were able to experience a different
Sure,
environment,
absolutely,
healed
absolutely.
you. And like, I mean, I assume it made you angrier, right? Because you said
Yeah.
something that was
Okay, well,
functional.
it goes back to some of our relations with these backward white students. I say I'm just separating these white students. Is that one of the reasons why that clash occurred is because we're saying, look, you're not in racist America and you don't have white privilege here. You get out of line, you get popped, and they're not getting. And you know, so what happened in Detroit? America is not going to happen in Cuba. Okay.
Mhm.
So the point here is that um, uh, they still want to operate with that white privilege as though they're in the USA. I said, and then so we're gonna police that behavior. All right,
Mhm.
we will.
So you saw it as an opportunity to, since they didn't have access to white privilege because you're no longer in North America, you saw their identity change and their treatment change. So
Well,
you were able
no,
to
their
communicate
attitudes
with
were
them
no,
differently.
their privileged attitude of their. I mean,
I'm
it's
saying you
just
can walk in with the attitude, but then you just said that white privilege works differently in Cuba. That's what you just said, correct?
oh, okay. No, well, I didn't mean that. I said,
Oh,
well,
okay. That's what I thought you just said. Never
okay.
mind that.
No, I said that they don't have that same white privilege in Cuba. Now in Cuba,
Yeah. So then you saw their
okay,
identity change in Cuba,
right.
right?
Now, now in Cuba, you know, Cuba is a former colony, you know, colonized by the Spanish and all that, and so that there is
But
there's
whiteness
a
in
there,
North
yeah,
America
you're
and
right.
whiteness in Cuba is different, right?
Yeah, but it's there is
Yeah.
white
So then when you're
there is
fighting with
white
white
privilege in
people
Cuba.
in a country where
That's right.
whiteness functions different, then
Right,
you
right.
get to have you have different accesses as a black person potentially, maybe.
Yeah. Okay. Here's what I'm saying. Going back to Cuban society. There is racism in Cuba, among
I
Cubans.
know. I guess what I was
Okay, all right.
asking and
Okay,
like
okay.
what I was perceiving you say was that their white identities were challenged in Cuba because they're not functioning through a North American like white
That's correct.
supremacy lens.
That's
They're
That's right.
functioning through a Cuban white supremacy lens, which just functions differently than how they're navigating.
Mhm.
But then there's still
No,
80 of you coming from the US. There's a
Mhm.
microcosm of how North American white body supremacy works. So
Mhm.
it's disruptive, but now they're able to, without knowing, and
Mhm.
your observation, they're seeing the ins and outs of that, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Which is like maybe creating more tension within your group because people are messing with them in this exterior in a different function versus like that way. So I'm just, is that that's what I thought you were saying. So I just
Mhm.
clarification on
Mhm.
these two lenses that maybe you saw some of these white students functioning in, which was very provoking, but like they're just very disjointed because they don't know what's going on. And because you're a black person, you're always observed, right? And you see your observation. So you can see you just have multiple eyes and they only have one set.
Mhm. Mhm.
No, yeah, sorry, just asking.
Right. And the other impression says that I went to their medical school. They had a nice medical complex. And you go into those schools, and a large part of that medical student body were from Africa, from Latin America, from that. I mean, and you can see they put a heavy investment in their medical schools and their medical facilities. And so they have decided, okay, uh, what is going to be our strength? And say our strength is going to be in health and in education. Right? And so that's where they put most of their investment. And then in terms of the education, you know, what they did, see, a lot of the students, Cubans were poor, okay? And what they did is they began to build huge educational complex, boarding schools, where they have physical facilities, all these things, where they can bring those youth and they in these boarding schools and they go back to their homes during the summer and all that. So that's one of the ways that so we're going to build these little academies and all. And so, as I said before, if you compare the Cubans, particularly given their resources, what they have done in the area of education, in the area of medical, and then Cuba has been sending medical personnel, doctors and nurses to all these other countries, right, with their investment. And so it's known for its medical system and its educational system. And the Cubans were among the most highly Latins in Latin America. Despite the U.S. in all its efforts to destroy their system, the U.S. sponsored an invasion See how they organized that, talk about a regime change. And then they economically still try to cripple them. To this day, right now, if you go to Cuba, if you eventually get over there, you don't bring a credit card or debit card. You know why? They pull them out of the financial system. No banks and all that sort of thing. If you spend money back, you have to use cash because U.S. is trying to crush them economically, won't try to isolate them. Okay. So Cuba has been like a beacon of inspiration. And then most of the revolutionary movements, it's very common to see pictures of what? Che Guevara, in terms of what he represented, in terms of liberation. And I know in our organization, who and also in the League of Black Revolutionary Workers, we always had a picture up there of Che Guevara because of his sacrifice and his dedication. And so he was fighting with guerrilla groups in Latin America and also in Africa, everywhere. He said, the people rise up. You have a right of basic human rights. Any system that denies you your human rights, fight. And so he became a symbol of a revolutionary. So, Black Panther Party, there's Che Guevara, right? And all this on it, Che Guevara. What's he got? He's associated with the Cuban Revolution. And that's why you look at all the Black militants and radicals, period, they always, pay homage to Cuba, to the Cuban Revolution. And that's why the U.S. still wants to crush it. And those who were in rebellion against the Cuban Revolution, all these right-wing white Cubans in Miami. When they call all those Republicans and all that sort of thing, and talk about Latino Republicans, they're not talking about the Mexicans, they're talking about these white Cubans, right? Who left, and that was the wealthy class. They went there. They said, "Whoa!" Last thing they wanted was a socialist revolution. So you begin to understand, well, why is Miami so right wing? Because you got all those right wing white Cubans down there. That's why.
Are there other kind of questions you want me to ask you? Or how did that feel for you, Dad?
Well,
We can wrap it up as well, but this was
Oh,
excellent.
okay.
This
Do
was,
you want to stop recording then?
I will stop recording.
Okay.